34 windows lit up against the dark. One woman bleeding out on the pavement below. No arrests that night. Let's kick things off with a cold March night in 1964 Queens. A narrow street in Kew Gardens. Row after row of brick apartment buildings, stairwells echoing with the last footsteps of residents heading in from the subway. In the glow of a street lamp, a young woman named Kitty Genovese walks home from a late shift at a bar, heels clicking, keys in hand, expecting nothing more dramatic than an empty hallway and a quiet bed. Then the quiet breaks. A man steps out near the parking lot. A flash of movement. A knife. Kitty's first scream slices up the fade of the building, hitting glass, curtains, and sleeping faces. Lights flick on. Blinds twitch. Windows open just an inch. The sound is unmistakable. Someone is being attacked. Within hours, this would be the start of an event that changed far more than one neighborhood. In the days that followed, a now infamous newspaper story claimed that 38 witnesses watched or heard parts of the assault and did nothing. No one came down. No one called the police in time. A murder transformed almost overnight into a symbol of urban apathy, as if an entire community had collectively decided to let a stranger die. The reality of that night unfolded in brutal, cinematic beats. The first assault happens near the parking lot, under that lone street lamp. Kitty screams, stumbles, collapses. Above her, windows flare to life like a row of eyes snapping open. A voice from one of those windows shouts into the darkness, "Leave that girl alone." For a moment, it works. The attacker pulls back, melts into the shadows, and the street goes quiet again. But the story does not end there. Minutes pass. Some residents step away from the glass, assuming the danger has passed, assuming someone else has already called for help. The attacker returns, tracking Kitty to a nearby entrance, then into a stairwell just out of clear sight. The screams start again, weaker now, echoing off concrete and tile. By the time one neighbor finally reaches her and the police are contacted, her life is slipping away. She dies in an ambulance, not in a crowded street, but effectively alone. Throughout his life, Dexter Morgan relied on complacent neighbors and silent colleagues to keep his own victims hidden. Here, in real life, silence played an even more devastating role. How does a crime that stretches over roughly half an hour, with an earshot and partial view of dozens of people, end with a body on a stretcher and a city asking who failed her? In this video, we're going to dive deep into that question. The simple story of 34 witnesses who did nothing is powerful, but it is also incomplete. The next sections will unpack what residents actually did, what the police records and later investigations discovered, and how one night in Queens helped define the bystander effect, reshape law, and permanently alter how responsibility is understood, police reports, trial transcripts, original interviews, and surviving witnesses. What they discovered was not a building full of villains, but a building full of fragmented perceptions, half-understood sounds, and hesitant reactions. Some residents did call the police, though not always quickly or clearly. Some shouted from windows, driving the attacker away at least once. And one neighbor, Sophia Farrar, ran toward the danger, held Kitty in her arms, and stayed with her as she died. So the question for this video is not simply whether the witnesses helped or failed, in a clean binary that lets everyone else feel safe. The deeper question is why help came so slowly, in such scattered, uncertain ways, even as multiple residents sensed that something was wrong. Throughout his life, Dexter counts on that same hesitation, that instinct to look away, to keep his dark passenger hidden in plain sight. The Genovese case forces attention on the gap between suspicion and action, between noticing harm and accepting responsibility. To map that gap, the breakdown will follow a clear structure. First, the night itself will be reconstructed, scene by scene. using what the best available records say about those 38 witnesses who heard a scream, who saw a figure in the courtyard, who opened a door and then closed it again. Then the focus will shift to the psychology that grew out of this narrative, the so-called bystander effect, and the experiments that tried to explain why people freeze, defer, or assume someone else will act. From there, the lens will widen beyond one crime scene in 1964. The same patterns of diffusion and denial show up in public assaults filmed on phones, in workplaces where everyone knows a manager is abusive, and in online harassment campaigns where thousands watch while a target is slowly destroyed. In each case, the question is the same. How do ordinary witnesses become passive participants? And what are the long-term effects of that silence? Let's kick things off with a boundary. This is not a gore-focused true crime retelling, and it is not a character study of the killer, as if he were Dexter working through a personal code. This video is an analytical, documentary-style essay about witnesses, silence, and responsibility, using Kitty Genovese as the spine while branching into broader patterns of complicity. The next section will stay with that spine and walk through the night itself, moment by moment, to see what really happened before the legend took over. The legend of Kitty Genovese did not just reshape one neighborhood. It became an event that changed how an entire field thought about silence. Newspapers framed it as a moral collapse of a city. 30+ witnesses. No one helping. For most readers, it was a horror story about New York. For two social psychologists, it was something else. A puzzle. Bib Latan and John Darley read those early Genovese headlines and could not let them go. Were these neighbors uniquely cold, or had the coverage accidentally exposed a deeper pattern in human behavior? Their question was simple but brutal. If Dexter's fictional victims were surrounded by people whose agency evaporated, the more apparent witnesses there were, the less any single person felt pushed to act. This would be the start of what Latan and Darley named the bystander effect. In simple terms, the bystander effect is a psychological code that flips responsibility on its head. As group size increases, individual sense of duty decreases. Especially when the situation is ambiguous, everyone looks to everyone else for cues. If no one moves, the silence itself becomes a signal that maybe nothing is wrong, that the danger is exaggerated, that consequences belong to someone else. Now, go back to Kitty's building. Dozens of windows, dozens of partial views. Someone hears a scream but cannot see the attacker. Someone sees a couple struggling and assumes it is a lover's quarrel. Each neighbor holds a fragment, not the full truth. Each one can imagine that someone closer to the street, someone with a better angle, someone less afraid of the police, has already called. The building becomes a living experiment in diffusion of responsibility. Throughout his life, Dexter walked through similar social blind spots, relying on coworkers, neighbors, and even family to misread or minimize what they saw. Latan and Darley's work suggested that this was not just narrative drama, it tapped into a repeatable human failure. But here is where we're going to dive deep. In the next sections, we will test the bystander effect against modern predators, viral assault videos, and workplaces where everyone quietly knows who the problem is. The question is whether this classic theory still explains the silence around real-world killers and abusers, or whether something darker has been hiding behind the language of psychology all along. To see what the bystander effect really looked like in practice, we have to rewind one specific night. Before psychologists named the pattern, before headlines simplified it into a myth, there was a concrete sequence of minutes in which a woman fought for her life while an entire building listened. Let's kick things off with the moment the clock quietly crossed 3 a.m. Kitty Genovese finished her shift at Ev's 11th hour bar in Queens and drove home toward Kew Gardens. The streets were mostly empty, sodium lights washing the parked cars in a flat orange glow. Behind her, Winston Moseley cruised slowly, hunting for victims the way a predator circles a herd. He had already decided to kill that night. The only open question was who. When Kitty parked about 100 feet from her apartment building, that question was answered. She stepped out, locked the car, and started toward the front entrance. Moseley followed on foot. On an ordinary night, this walk would have been nothing. On this night, it became an event that changed not just her life, but the way an entire country talked about responsibility. Near the parking lot, Moseley rushed her. A quick lunge. A knife. Kitty's scream cut through the quiet, "Oh my God, he stabbed me. Help me." Realizing no police were arriving, Moseley returned. He tracked Kitty to the back entrance, found her collapsed in the stairwell, and resumed the attack, now mostly out of sight. Behind apartment doors, residents who had already made the choice not to escalate assumed the crisis was over. The window of intervention was closing minute by minute. Only later did the pattern break. Neighbor Sophia Farrar, alarmed and unwilling to wait any longer, came down, entering the same physical space others had only watched from afar. She found Kitty bleeding in the stairwell, held her, and urged another resident to finally call an ambulance. Help did come, but it was too late to save her life. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into what each of those observers saw, believed, and failed to do, and how their fragmented perspectives built the legend of 38 witnesses while hiding a more complicated truth. 34 people. A single courtyard. One woman dying in the dark. On paper, it sounds like a crowd watching a kill in real time, but the reality inside that building was far more fragmented and far more human. The famous number, 34 to 38 witnesses, did not come from a neat roster of spectators pressed against their windows. It came from police canvases and later journalistic reconstructions, counting anyone who heard screams, glimpsed a struggle, or spoke to investigators afterward. Some residents saw a silhouette. Some heard a cry. Some only realized they were witnesses when detectives knocked on the door days later and asked what they had heard that night. So let's kick things off with the man whose voice briefly cut through the violence. From a higher floor, front-facing window, one resident leaned out and shouted, "Leave that girl alone." He could see the parking lot, but not the knife, not the blood, not the full intent to kill. In his mind, this was an ugly confrontation. Maybe a mugging that could be scared off. An event that changed tone the moment his voice echoed down. When the attacker retreated into the shadows, that man believed his intervention had worked. In another apartment, a couple heard the same cries and the sound of a struggle. But their window faced the street, not the alley. They saw no weapon, only partial movement between parked cars. Throughout his life, that kind of late-night noise had meant domestic disputes, lovers' quarrels, arguments that burned hot and then fizzled. They argued briefly about calling the police, then convinced themselves it was a private matter. The long-term effects of that small, quiet decision would haunt them when the full truth was reported. Deeper in the building, away from direct sight lines, lived the neighbor who made a different choice. From an interior unit, the sounds were muffled, distorted by walls and distance. It was clearly distress, but was it an attack or a drunken argument? Instead of dialing the police, this neighbor called a friend for advice. That extra step, that instinct to seek social proof before acting, cost minutes. The man leaned out into the cold air and shouted something like, "Hey, get your hands off her or leave that girl alone." The words cut through the night, and they worked. Moseley pulled back, startled, retreating toward his car, the way a predator backs off when a light suddenly hits the alley. From that vantage point, what did the neighbor actually see? Probably not a cinematic stabbing framed under a street lamp. More likely, a man and a woman struggling near a car, their bodies partly hidden by shadows, a flash of movement that could have been a hand, a purse, or a knife. In a city where arguments erupt on sidewalks every day, the brain reaches for the least catastrophic explanation. A lover's quarrel, a mugging already interrupted. Conflict, not murder. This is where we're going to dive deep into perception. The neighbor's shout did interrupt the first sequence. In his mind, that may have been a successful intervention. He yelled, the assailant backed off, Kitty managed to move away. The script that followed in his head was simple. The danger ended when the noise stopped. No need to call the police. No need to rush downstairs and enter what looked like a resolved confrontation. Psychologists later studying the bystander effect would describe this as a threshold of certainty. Most people feel an internal bar that has to be cleared before escalating to authorities. At night, in a dense city, that bar climbs even higher. No one wants to be the neighbor who dragged the police into what turns out to be a domestic argument or an embarrassing misunderstanding. The social cost of overreacting feels immediate and personal. The consequences of underreacting feel distant and abstract until they are not. There is also a powerful element of social proof here. That shout did not just communicate with Mosley. It communicated with every other window. It signaled that someone had seen, someone had acted, and the script could safely close. When the attacker drove off, the courtyard returned to its default silence, and that silence itself became evidence that the crisis had passed. The chilling irony is that this brief act of courage did both. It bought Kitty precious minutes of life, disrupting the first attempt to kill her. But it may also have lulled the building into a collective exhale, convincing other witnesses that the problem was handled while Mosley quietly regrouped for a second attack. This would be the start of a pattern that echoes throughout his life and across other predators. Partial intervention that interrupts the moment, but not the threat. In the next section, that illusion of safety is going to break. That illusion of safety breaks not with a scream, but with a question. A neighbor hears the chaos outside, pauses at the phone, and instead of dialing the police, calls a friend to ask whether they should get involved. In that moment, the emergency becomes a conversation topic, not an action trigger. Let's kick things off with that apartment, that handset, and that hesitation. This neighbor reportedly describes hearing a fight, maybe a woman in distress, maybe a drunk, the hope that witnesses will second-guess what they heard, that no one wants to be the one who overreacted. In the Genovese case, several witnesses later tell investigators that they assumed someone closer to the street must have already called. Others believe the neighbor who shouted earlier had finished the job, that the predator was gone, that the victim was safe. Their inaction does not feel like a decision. It feels like deferring to an invisible someone else who surely has it handled. This is diffusion of responsibility in real time. When many people share potential responsibility, each person feels less personal obligation to act, especially when the perceived consequences of being wrong are high. Calling could waste police resources. It could anger neighbors who dislike attention. It could expose the caller as dramatic or unreliable. Doing nothing, by contrast, feels like staying neutral, even though neutrality in that moment quietly sides with the attacker. Psychologists later demonstrate this pattern in controlled experiments, but the building that night is the live-action version. Calm windows signal that maybe it is not an emergency. Silence becomes social proof. The dark passenger in the courtyard is not just the killer. It is the collective urge to wait, to watch, to let the system, the crowd, or some faceless authority intervene. And this would be the start of a pattern that does not stay on that Queens sidewalk. Decades later, the same logic plays out in office harassment cases, in viral assault videos, in group chats where everyone has seen the evidence but no one wants to be the first to report. Cameras roll, views climb, HR inboxes fill with rumors, but the actual call to stop a predator lags behind. In the next section, that delay is going to move from the street and the screen into institutions that claim to protect victims, and we will see how often they choose to protect themselves instead. That institutional delay had a human mirror long before email chains and HR forms, and it lived in a single Queens apartment building. In a sea of frozen windows, one person actually moved. Her name was Sophia Farrar. Sophia was not an anonymous silhouette at the glass. She was Kitty Genovese's friend, a neighbor who knew her laugh, her routines, the ordinary details that turn a stranger into a real person. When a neighbor pounded on her door and said Kitty was hurt, Sophia did not stop to calculate probabilities or wait for someone else to interpret the screams. She ran, down into the dark stairwell, in her nightgown, barefoot, not knowing if the man who had just tried to kill her friend was still there. On paper, that choice makes no sense. The hallway was still, the courtyard half-lit, the air thick with the echo of what had already happened. Other neighbors had looked out, seen a struggle, heard cries, then retreated into analysis and hesitation. Sophia moved in the opposite direction. Where most residents treated the danger as an abstract event happening out there, she treated it as an event that changed her immediate reality. The difference between those two frames is the difference between calling from behind a lock. Sophia's default was action, not analysis. The long-term effects of that kind of reflex are complicated. It is brave, but it is also costly. Because Sophia paid a price, entering that stairwell meant absorbing the sights, sounds, and touch that everyone else kept at a distance. Trauma does not just land on victims, it splashes onto the people who finally step in. Yet without someone like her, the story collapses into a lie about total apathy. This building was not uniformly cold. It existed on a spectrum: those who ignored, those who half-acted from behind glass, and the one who crossed the threshold. So here is the harder question. In a building with 34 witnesses, why was there only one Sophia? And in our own communities, from office corridors to digital comment sections, how do we increase that number without demanding that every person become a martyr? In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how systems, policies, and leaders can either manufacture more Sophias or quietly train everyone to stay at the window. Sophia's call broke the spell for one person. But on the night Kitty Genovese was killed, the system as a whole never truly woke up. 0 arrests were made, not just in the courtyard, not just in the stairwell, but across the entire response chain that was supposed to protect a woman screaming for her life. Let's kick things off with the most unsettling detail. Winston Moseley walked away. He stabbed, chased, returned, and finished the attack, then simply got back in his car, drove out of Kew Gardens, and went home. No one stopped him in the lobby. No patrol car cut him off at the corner. Throughout his life before that night, he had blended in as a quiet, respectable man, with a job and a family, and that image held. The killer left the scene looking like every other neighbor who had just heard a disturbance and decided it was not their problem. The police response mirrored that fragmentation. Calls, when they did come, were vague. A woman screaming. A disturbance. Lights in the courtyard. No clear address, no description of the attacker, no insistent voice refusing to hang up until someone arrived. Dispatchers treated it like noise in a big city soundscape, rather than a precise, actionable emergency. This would be the start of a pattern that social psychologists later tried to map in experiments. When responsibility is diffused across many ears, the urgency in each individual voice drains away. Part of the failure was technological and bureaucratic. In 1964, there was no single 911 number, no unified code that instantly flagged a life-threatening attack. Residents had to know which local precinct to call, or dial an operator, and hope the message traveled fast enough. That ambiguity made it easy for the system to misclassify the whole event, to file it mentally under domestic argument or noisy neighbors instead of imminent kill, for the wrong reasons. On paper, it looks methodical. A car theft, a burglary pattern, a name in a report. But in the weeks after Kitty Genovese's murder, there was nothing methodical about the search for her killer. There was only absence. No clear suspect, no dramatic lineup of terrified neighbors pointing at a face, just a neighborhood that went back to work while the front pages turned her death into a spectacle. Throughout his life, Winston Moseley had blended into that ordinary backdrop. A married man, a father, someone who did not match the cinematic image of a predator. Detectives canvassed, asked questions, retraced Kitty's final walk. Neighbors remembered screams, lights in windows, a woman collapsing in a hallway. What they did not produce was a name. The sensational narrative about 34 witnesses exploded in the press, but inside the precinct there was mostly frustration and dead ends. The break came from somewhere completely different. A few weeks later, a patrol officer in Queens saw a parked car with its engine running and a man carrying a television set out of a house. No chase through dark alleys, no manhunt tied to a notorious murder, just a routine burglary stop. Moseley was arrested not as a suspected killer, but as someone stealing a TV. This is the pattern interrupt that matters. The case that would redefine how psychology textbooks talk about bystanders did not move forward because witnesses rallied. It moved because Moseley made a mistake during a property crime and ran into an officer doing basic, unglamorous work. From there, the narrative shifted. At the station, detectives started asking questions that did not line up with a simple burglary. His story changed. His timeline had gaps. As questioning intensified, detectives began to connect him to other unsolved attacks. What started as a single burglary file opened into something far darker. Moseley eventually confessed not only to Kitty's murder, but to multiple rapes and killings, revealing a pattern of predation that had slipped past neighbors, co-workers, and the broader system. The truth was not that he suddenly became dangerous the night Kitty died. The truth was that this would be the start of the public finally seeing what had been there all along. Witnesses did appear later in court. Some testified about what they heard or saw from their windows, providing a timeline that supported Moseley's confession. But their role was largely corroborative. The real breakthrough did not come from a collective crisis of conscience among the 34. It came from routine policing intersecting with a criminal who believed he was invisible. Harry's code in Dexter is built around never getting caught, around anticipating how the system actually works. Moseley had no such code, yet he still evaded serious suspicion until chance intervened. That is the grim theme here. Systems often catch predators by accident, while communities that sensed something was wrong, opposite of Harry stepping in when he discovered Dexter's urges and deciding, disastrously, to act. But when later journalists and historians went back, they discovered a very different timeline. Some witnesses did call the police, though calls were delayed or misrouted. One neighbor shouted from a window and briefly scared the attacker off. Another woman, Sophia Farrar, went down the stairs, into the dark, and cradled Kitty as she was dying. Others heard screams but thought they were a drunken argument or a domestic dispute, not a stranger trying to kill. The attack itself was not a clean 30-minute spectacle. It was broken, chaotic, moving from one location to another while people pieced together fragments of sound and shadow. Throughout his life, Dexter relies on chaos and misinterpretation in the same way. Neighbors see trash bags, colleagues see late nights, but the pattern never quite locks in. The Genovese myth flattens that messy human perception into caricature. Everyone watched and no one cared is emotionally sharper, easier to repeat, and far more viral than some people misheard. Some tried, some froze, and the system still failed. The neat version feels like a moral sledgehammer. The true version is harder to summarize, but closer to how real victims and real communities actually collide. Debunking the legend, though, does not redeem anyone. It reveals something worse. People cared just enough to howl fact. A shout instead of a sustained alarm. A phone call made late, without pressing for a response. A neighbor who comforts the victim, but only after the killer has already gone. This would be the start of a more unsettling lesson. Partial courage can be indistinguishable, in outcome, from total apathy. The consequences are the same. That nuance matters for modern parallels, including the world around Dexter. Coworkers joke that someone is creepy. Families whisper that an uncle should not be left alone with kids. Officers trade rumors about a colleague whose cases always end in bodies. Good intentions, fear of being wrong, confusion about what is really happening, and the social pressure not to accuse all braid together into deadly hesitation. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how that hesitation operates in groups and how predators quietly learn to depend on it. That hesitation is not random. It follows a pattern so reliable that social psychologists gave it a name: diffusion of responsibility. When many people could act, each individual feels less personally responsible for what happens and more justified in doing nothing. The potential duty to intervene spreads out across the group until it becomes almost invisible. Let's kick things off with a simple thought experiment. Imagine hearing a scream in a silent cabin in the woods. No neighbors, no passing cars, no security guards. In that moment, it is unmistakably clear that if anyone is going to help, it has to be the person in that cabin. Now move that same scream into a crowded apartment building at midnight. Braver or more informed would already be intervening. In a dense city, anonymity amplifies that effect. Neighbors become silhouettes behind glass, not characters with names, histories, and obligations. When there is no relationship, there is less felt duty. Emergencies start to look like private problems, not collective crises. The same way Harry looked at Dexter's urges and decided to create a code in secret, rather than expose the truth to his colleagues, urban bystanders learn to treat danger as someone else's business, handled by distant authorities. This would be the start of a much larger pattern. Diffusion of responsibility does not just operate in dark stairwells. It shows up in corporate scandals, where everyone assumes legal will step in online dogpiles, where thousands witness harassment, but wait for moderators to kill the thread. In workplaces where everyone has heard rumors about a predatory manager, yet assumes HR already knows. The more people who see, the easier it becomes for each observer to believe that silence is neutral. The long-term effects of that silence are brutal. Predators, whether a serial killer like Dexter or a real-world abuser, quietly learn that as long as responsibility is blurred and shared, consequences can be dodged. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how some offenders actively engineer that blur, cultivating confusion, loyalty, and fear, so that entire communities become passive witnesses to their crimes. That blur of responsibility has a twin, and it lives inside each witness's head. It is not just that accountability gets spread around. Perception itself gets edited by the crowd. Social psychologists call this pluralistic ignorance, and it turns a hallway full of uneasy neighbors into a silent chorus of denial. Pluralistic ignorance happens when almost everyone senses that something is off. But because no one else is reacting, each person concludes they must be misreading the situation. The private alarm is real. The public performance is calm. That gap is where danger breathes. Throughout his life, Dexter depended on that gap, trusting that as long as everyone else kept a straight face, his dark passenger could move in plain sight. To see how this plays out, imagine one possible night in Kitty Genovese's building. A resident snaps awake to a sharp, tearing scream in the courtyard. Heart racing, they move to the window, pulling the curtain back just an inch. Across the way, 2 or 3 silhouettes are visible in other windows. No one is rushing downstairs. No one is banging on doors. There are no alarms, no shouted commands, no visible panic. The resident's first instinct is to act, grab the phone, call the police. But then the social scan kicks in. If this were truly life or death, wouldn't someone already be on the move? Maybe it is a lover's quarrel. Maybe someone else has already called. Maybe stepping in would be an overreaction, with consequences for everyone in the building. That internal monologue slowly reframes an emergency as an awkward domestic scene that should be ignored. Lawton and Darley captured this same pattern in a Say Something. Because no one does, the behavior is downgraded in real time from unacceptable to uncomfortable but normal. That silence is what allows the pattern to escalate. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how certain offenders do not just benefit from pluralistic ignorance, but actively manufacture it, turning social cues, loyalty, and fear into a custom-built shield around their victims. That custom-built shield doesn't just run on silence and social cues. It runs on fear. Real, rational fear. Let's kick things off with a hard admission. Going down into a dark street at 3 a.m. To confront a possibly armed attacker is not heroic cinema. It is potentially suicidal. In the Kitty Genovese case, some neighbors later described hearing what sounded like a drunken argument, then realizing it was a violent attack, then freezing at the thought that the killer might notice them at the window. Throughout his life, Dexter counted on that same calculation. Any neighbor who heard a muffled struggle from his apartment would have to decide whether opening the door meant walking straight into a kill. Psychologists Lawton and Darley called it the bystander effect, but underneath the label is a simple equation: risk to self versus obligation to the victim. People weigh whether stepping in could leave their own kids without a parent, whether calling the police might bring retaliation from someone who knows where they live, whether becoming a witness means living with court dates, cross-examination, and the dark passenger of constant fear. Protecting family, staying behind a locked door, can feel like the only responsible choice. Here's the twist that turns fear into a pattern. The more potential helpers present, the more justified self-preservation feels. In a crowded apartment complex, it is easy to think, someone without kids should go, or a younger neighbor will handle this. In a workplace where everyone has heard that the boss goes too far at office parties, employees silently rank themselves. The one on probation, the one close to retirement, the one who just cannot afford to be a target. Each person's calculation feels rational, even compassionate toward their own families, while the victim is left alone. This is where the moral gray area opens up. At what point does protecting self and family cross into abandoning someone else to be killed or abused? If there is a single witness, inaction feels like a direct choice with clear consequences. When there are 34, responsibility dissolves into the crowd. Harry's choice to create a code that let Dexter kill only deserving victims was also framed as protection, a way to keep a dangerous son from prison or death. Yet those same protective instincts produced a hidden trail of bodies. So instead of writing every silent neighbor off as a coward, this is the moment to pivot. The question becomes less, why didn't they act? And more, what environments, systems, and norms made it so easy not to? In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how certain offenders learn to weaponize that fear and diffusion of responsibility, actively engineering situations. General expectation turns into specific paralysis. In classic studies, when people believed they were the only one who could hear someone having a seizure, most acted quickly. When they thought several others were also listening, many stayed frozen, assuming someone else would make the call. This is where the actor-observer gap locks in. Others are judged by visible behavior. Neighbors who stay behind curtains become cowards. But the self is judged by intention, by private narratives that never reach the street. It sounded like a couple fighting. It was probably a prank. Someone closer must have already called. The external action looks identical to apathy. Internally, it feels like cautious rationality, even moral restraint. That is the uncomfortable bridge back to those 34 witnesses. None of them woke up that day planning to abandon a stranger to die. Most did not experience themselves as villains in the story. This would be the start of a lifelong pattern, where memory edits the scene just enough to protect self-image. A half-heard cry becomes not clear enough. A brief glance from the window becomes there was nothing to see. The absence of a phone call becomes the line was probably already busy. The long-term effects of that kind of self-protection are devastating, because they keep the lesson from landing. So the point here is not to wallow in inherited guilt or rehearse outrage at people who can no longer answer back. The point is pre-commitment. Emergencies are noisy, ambiguous, and socially pressurized. Adrenaline narrows perception, and the brain scans the room for social proof. If others look calm, danger is downgraded. If no one moves, inaction feels reasonable. Deciding in advance, if there is a scream, the call happens first, questions later, is like Harry writing a code for a different kind of dark passenger, one that resists diffusion rather than killing under its cover. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how certain predators learn to exploit exactly this psychological terrain, turning ordinary hesitation into a shield that keeps their victims invisible and their own lives undisturbed. If the streets around Kitty's building became a kind of improvised lab, then classic psychology experiments tried to build that same horror under fluorescent lights and clipboards. To understand how 30-plus neighbors could hear attacks and still wait, we're going to dive deep into what happens when an emergency is reduced to intercoms, smoke, and silence. Let's kick things off with the seizure experiment, an event that changed how social psychology talked about responsibility. Participants believed they were in a group discussion over an intercom, talking about college life and personal problems. One voice on the line, presented as another participant, began to stutter, gasp, and plead for help, describing what sounded like a seizure. The key twist was invisible. Some believed they were the only listener. Others believed there were several people on the line. When someone thought they were the only witness, help came fast. Most left the booth almost immediately, found the experimenter, and tried to intervene. But as the perceived group size increased, brutally consistent. When a person believed they were the only one aware, they acted. When they believed others were also aware, they delayed or froze. Even when the danger was obvious, responsibility diffused outward, and pluralistic ignorance turned everyone's blank face into false reassurance. Now map that back onto Kitty's courtyard. Multiple windows, overlapping shouts, fragmented views of shadows and struggling bodies. Each resident could imagine another resident closer, more informed, already on the phone. Everyone waited for a signal that never came, and everyone else's inaction became that signal. Critics argue that lab emergencies are simplified, that no staged seizure or controlled smoke can capture the visceral terror of a real knife, a real scream, or a real decision to kill. But the core mechanisms Latin and Darley isolated have been discovered again and again in real disasters, public assaults, and even modern online harassment. The long-term effects of that research show up whenever crowds film instead of intervene, whenever neighbors whisper about a predator but stay silent officially, and whenever a dark passenger hides in plain sight, protected not by brilliance, but by collective hesitation. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how predators, from serial abusers to calculated killers, learn to weaponize that hesitation, turning diffusion of responsibility into an informal code that keeps their victims alone and their own lives untouched. Predators learning to weaponize hesitation might sound abstract, until we watch it play out on grainy CTV and shaky phone footage. Again and again, the pattern repeats: a crowded scene, a clear victim, and a ring of potential helpers who become passive witnesses instead. Let's kick things off with the public assaults that unfold in full view of cameras and crowds. A man collapses in a busy transit station. Commuters split around his body like water around a rock. Some glance down, some step over his legs. Most keep walking. In other clips, a person is punched, kicked, dragged along a sidewalk, while a semicircle of onlookers forms a silent perimeter. The violence escalates. The dark passenger driving the attacker faces no immediate challenge, because everyone is waiting for someone else to move first. On subways, the same script plays out in a tighter frame. Train cars are full, shoulders touch, the social pressure is intense. A rider starts harassing a woman, shouting, crowding her space, maybe grabbing her arm. People stare at their phones, fixate on the floor, pretend the argument is about nothing serious. Often, one person finally stands up, placing a body between predator and target, or pulling the emergency handle. But that intervention usually comes after long minutes, where dozens of witnesses have silently calculated the risk and chosen self-preservation over confrontation. The car becomes a moving experiment in diffusion of responsibility. Viral street harassment videos make this even more explicit. Formal code that protects abusers the way Harry's code protected Dexter, by keeping consequences at bay. All of this reinforces that the bystander effect is not a historical curiosity tied to one New York murder. It is a recurring feature of social behavior that predators can count on. The long-term effects of that silence ripple outward, shaping who feels safe, who gets targeted, and who learns that they can kill reputations, bodies, or entire lives in plain sight. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how those predators study these reactions, almost the way Dexter studied blood spatter, turning crowd psychology into a weapon so effective that by the time anyone acts, the damage is already done. Predators learn from that silence. They watch how crowds hesitate, how neighbors glance away, and they realize something terrifying. Danger can live in plain sight as long as it never feels like a single, undeniable event. Let's kick things off with a composite scene that many communities would recognize. There is a man on the block, the one parents quietly warn about at family gatherings. He hugs children too long at birthday parties. He volunteers to drive the late carpool. He makes comments that adults dismiss as just jokes, even when those jokes leave the room tense and frozen for a second. At Thanksgiving, an aunt leans over and says, "Keep the kids away from him." And everyone nods, then changes the subject. Throughout his life in that town, this man accumulates a trail of moments. A babysitter who quits after an unsettling comment. A teenager who refuses to be alone with him. A neighbor who notices he always helps the same vulnerable kids. Each person holds a fragment, a single red flag that feels too small, too ambiguous to take to the police. Individually, these are anecdotes. Together, they are a pattern. This is where the Genovese dynamic comes back. In the original story, dozens of witnesses supposedly watched a murder and did nothing. In reality, some tried to help, some called, some misread what they were hearing. No one had the full picture. In the same way, everyone around this man has partial knowledge. One story here, one comment there, one late-night confession that gets brushed off. No one feels responsible for connecting the dots, because no one sees all the dots at once. Predators exploit that gap almost the way Dexter studies blood spatter. They cultivate a nice guy shell, coach, pastor, youth leader, boss. They show up with casseroles when someone is sick. They donate to local causes. They remember birthdays. So when a frightened teenager finally says, "He did something to me," the accusation collides with years of social capital. The community faces a brutal choice between the comforting persona and the disturbing claim. Challenging that persona carries consequences. Speaking up risks being labeled dramatic, vindictive, or unstable. It threatens friendships, church harmony, team cohesion, even careers. Side of it all, a manager everyone knows is a problem. He leans on the edge of a junior employee's desk, just a little too close. A hand lingers on a shoulder a second too long. He jokes about who looks hottest on the team, about what someone is wearing for Dexter on date night, about who should use those legs to charm a client. Laughter ripples out, but it's tight, strained. A few faces drop the moment he turns away. The air shifts, then smooths back over. Work resumes. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on silence and normalcy to hide a dark passenger. Predatory managers rely on something similar. No single moment looks like a kill. Each interaction is small, deniable, framed as a joke, an overreaction if anyone pushes back. That structure turns the entire office into a bystander test that runs every day at 10:15 a.m. right next to the coffee machine. Each coworker only sees a slice. One person hears the sexually suggestive comment about promotions and earning late-night one-on-ones. Another walks past a conference room and notices the door almost closed, that same manager sitting a little too close during a mentoring session. A third never sees the behavior directly, but hears rumors about private drinks after work, about someone leaving his office in tears. No one has the full case file. HR receives no formal complaint for months, sometimes years. This would be the start of a pattern that looks, from the inside, fragmented and fuzzy. From the outside, once the story finally breaks, it reads like a season-long arc, escalating violations, repeated warnings, a trail of victims. But in real time, every witness is holding a single blood slide, not the whole box. Social and career risks press down on every potential witness. Speaking up can feel like inviting the manager to kill a career instead of a body. People fear retaliation on performance reviews, being labeled difficult, losing access to projects, breaking team cohesion. In a culture that praises being a team player, the person who goes to HR first can feel like Harry refusing to follow the unwritten code of loyalty. So everyone waits for someone closer, more affected, more objective to move first. That hesitation is diffusion of responsibility in action. The more people who know, the easier it is to believe someone else will act. If it were really that bad, surely the direct reports would have gone to HR. Surely the senior women would have said something. Surely leadership must already know. Each assumption makes personal inaction feel less like a choice and more like a neutral default. Then an event that changed everything hits. A lawsuit, a leaked email thread, an external investigation. Suddenly, the narrative snaps into focus. Articles come out, internal memos circulate. In interviews and DMs, coworkers repeat a haunting refrain, "We all kind of knew." The truth is discovered too late for the earliest victims, and the long-term effects of that collective silence echo the everyone knew sentiment from high-profile abuse cases. In the next section, to a kind of institutional detective squad that seems more focused on protecting the brand than protecting potential victims. The message is clear. Once the dark passenger of formal process is invoked, control is lost. Ambiguity makes this even more paralyzing. Throughout his life, Dexter lives in the gray area between justice and murder, and that same uncertainty shows up in everyday misconduct. Was that really harassment or just an awkward joke? Was that manager's late-night message a boundary violation or an overzealous attempt to mentor? When the accused holds power over someone's job, references, or reputation, that ambiguity becomes a shield. It lets bystanders tell themselves the code of professionalism demands patience, more evidence, one more incident, before anyone kills the illusion of normalcy by reporting. Organizations often reinforce this hesitation without ever saying it aloud. Reporting procedures can be labyrinthine, requiring multiple forms, meetings with strangers, and timelines that stretch for months. Promises of confidentiality are undercut when details leak, or when it becomes obvious who spoke up based on who is suddenly frozen out of meetings. People watch what happens to earlier complainants. Promotions evaporate. Social circles close ranks. Allies go silent. The long-term effects of that visible retaliation are powerful. The lesson is learned, the system is listening, but it is not necessarily on the side of those who discovered the problem. This is where diffusion of responsibility takes root. If HR feels hostile or ineffective, each individual feels justified in waiting. Maybe someone closer to the incident will report. Maybe the right victim will come forward with undeniable proof. Just as neighbors in the Genovese story looked at each other and hesitated, employees glance around the open office and assume someone else will make the hard choice. And this is not limited to corporations. In the next part, we're going to dive deep into how churches, schools, and entertainment industries create entire communities of long-term bystanders, where everyone knows the rumors, everyone senses the danger, and yet the official record stays clean, until one case finally explodes everything. And when whole communities learn to look away, the danger doesn't just stay in one office. It spreads into sanctuaries, classrooms, locker rooms, and fan bases that were supposed to be safe. Let's kick things off with a pattern that now feels chillingly familiar. A youth pastor, a beloved coach, a respected teacher. Over years, multiple victims report the same behavior. Late-night messages, private meetings that turn into assaults, punishments if anyone talks. Rumors circulate in hallways and parking lots. Parents compare notes. Yet instead of removing the accused, leadership quietly transfers them to another parish, another campus, another team. Officially, it is a reassignment or a fresh start. In reality, this would be the start of standards. Everyone knows a piece. One parent heard a confession from their child. Another trustee saw a complaint file. A staff member walked in on something almost impossible to explain away. But because leadership appears calm, because no one in charge is acting like there is an emergency, the rest of the group reads the room and stays quiet. Pluralistic ignorance does the work. If it were really that bad, surely someone else would have stepped in already. This is where Kitty's building comes back into focus. Residents looked to each other's windows for cues and, seeing no one panicking, downgraded the danger in their own minds. Members of institutions do the same with leadership. If the bishop, the superintendent, or the athletic director treats allegations as a PR problem instead of a crisis, the signal sent to everyone else is clear. Stay calm. Do nothing. Let it pass. The disturbing part is that this is not just a collection of individual moral failures. These systems are designed so that inaction is easy and action is punished. Whistleblowers lose jobs, social circles, entire careers. Silence keeps a community intact on the surface, even as more victims accumulate in the shadows. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into what it costs to break that silence, and how a single person's choice to act can either expose a killer or be buried by the very structures that promised protection. Silence in a hallway is one thing. Silence in a crowd of 10,000 is another. The apartment windows have multiplied into screens, notifications, and live chats. But the core question hasn't changed. When harm plays out in public, who actually moves from witness to actor? Let's kick things off with a scene that now happens every day. A streamer is live, the viewer count ticks past 10,000, and the chat explodes. At first it is jokes and reactions. Then a mistake, an awkward comment, a rumor dragged in from another platform. Within minutes, one person becomes the designated target. Insults stack up line by line. Old photos are posted. An address is dropped. Threats to kill, to pay a visit, to ruin a career scroll past so quickly the text becomes a blur. Some viewers spam laughing emojis. Others clip the worst moments and repost them, chasing algorithmic boosts and more followers. Most simply watch, scroll, or click away. The digital street corner fills with witnesses, but almost no one steps between the target and the crowd. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on neighbors, coworkers, and even police to look away. Here, the same dynamic plays out at scale, accelerated by bandwidth instead of stairwells. Social psychologists call this diffusion of responsibility, and online scale turns it into a default setting. When a stream shows 10,000 concurrent viewers, each individual presence feels microscopic. Reporting feels pointless. A single message defending the target feels like throwing a pebble into a hurricane. The internal logic becomes, if this were really dangerous, someone else would have stopped it already. That reputations are shredded, personal information is everywhere, and the target has already absorbed the psychological impact. This would be the start of a new bystander era. Not fewer witnesses, but more. Apartment windows have become smartphone screens, office gossip has become global comment threads, and yet the long-term effects of that transformation remain chillingly familiar. Have the numbers changed anything? Or have they simply made it easier for predators, mobs, and abusers to hide in plain sight? In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how platforms and communities can rewrite that code, and what it actually looks like to choose action over passive engagement when the dark passenger goes digital. If the last section was about rewriting the code of our communities, this one is about the moment that code breaks down on the sidewalk. A person is being beaten in broad daylight, pressed against a storefront window, while a loose ring of onlookers hangs back. No one rushes in. No one pulls the attacker away. What rises instead is a forest of glowing screens. From 3, 4, 5 angles, the assault is captured in crisp 4K. A bystander pans slowly across the scene. Another zooms in on the victim's face. Another holds the phone rocksteady like a tripod. Later, the clip will rack up millions of views, be dissected frame by frame, and be treated almost like a crime scene Dexter might analyze in his lab. In the moment, though, the most important detail is what is missing: direct intervention, or even someone clearly calling for help. Let's kick things off with the motives that sit under that raised phone. On the generous end, filming feels like gathering evidence, like building a digital blood slide box that will help identify the attacker, prove what happened, and make it harder for anyone to deny the truth later. There is also fear of being hurt, fear of becoming a target, fear of making the wrong choice in a chaotic situation. The camera becomes a shield against those urges to step in, a way to be present without being physically exposed. But there is a darker layer that mirrors the predators we have been tracking. In an attention economy, the same clip can become currency. Views, followers, a viral post, the assault is quietly reframed as content. Filming offers a way to feel involved, to feel like a witness with a role, while avoiding the more uncomfortable actions that carry real consequences, like confronting the attacker or staying with the victim after. Psychologically, this is powerful because it reduces cognitive dissonance. Throughout his life, Dexter told himself that following Harry's code made him a protector, not just a killer. Here, the filmer tells a similar internal story. I am helping by documenting. That story softens the clash between seeing a person in danger and not acting directly. Pressing record becomes a compromise that protects self-image, even as the victim remains just as vulnerable. Layered on top of that is diffusion of responsibility. It begins harassing a woman in a subway car, shouting, crowding her, then suddenly pulling a knife. For a few seconds, it looks like every other bystander effect story. Dozens of faces, frozen, calculating, hoping someone else will act. Then, one passenger moves. He stands up, steps between the attacker and the woman, and shouts a clear command: "Grab him." That single word slices through the fog. 2 more commuters seize the man's arms. Another hits the emergency brake. Someone else wedges the knife hand against a pole. Within moments, the attacker is on the floor, disarmed, held down by multiple strangers until transit police arrive. No one gets killed. The victim walks away alive. This is not an urban legend. Versions of this scene have been documented repeatedly on trains in New York, San Francisco, Tokyo, and across Europe, where groups of riders collectively restrain harassers or would-be killers. The pattern is striking. The same psychological forces that keep people frozen can, under the right triggers, flip into coordination. Those triggers are surprisingly specific. A visible escalation of violence, like a weapon or a shove, snaps the situation out of ambiguity and into undeniable danger. A vocal leader gives the crowd a script, turning vague urges to help into a concrete code. Stand up, hold his arm, hit the alarm. The clear absence of authority figures makes it obvious no one else is coming. In that vacuum, the first person to act becomes, functionally, the Harry of the scene, channeling everyone's urges away from paralysis and toward protection. Throughout his life, Dexter survived, because no one like that ever stepped forward at the right moment. In Kitty Geneviese's building, no such leader emerged. The architecture itself worked against coordination. Witnesses were sealed behind glass, peering from separate apartments, hearing fragments through walls. They could not see each other's faces, could not lock eyes, could not discover in real time that others shared the same horrified reaction. On the train, one person stands, others see it, and social proof cascades. In Kitty's courtyard, every resident is alone with the sound, assuming someone else has already called, or that the danger has passed. The physical layout turns a crowd into isolated spectators, the exact opposite of that impromptu team on the subway floor. This would be the start of a different way of reading the bystander effect, not as a hard law, but as a tendency that can be interrupted. With the right cues, with a visible leader, with norms that say intervene, crowds do not just watch victims, they shield them. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how those same cues can be engineered online, and how platforms, by design, can either train audiences to be that first person who stands up, or train everyone to keep scrolling. If platforms can train audiences to intervene, communities can also train them to do the opposite, to talk, to speculate, to whisper up at the worst crime scenes. How his blood analysis seems almost too precise. Yet, no one wants to be the person who says, on record, that a friendly coworker might kill. In that sense, gossip becomes a kind of moral performance. By sharing the story, by nodding along, by warning friends in private, participants feel aligned with the victims and distanced from the harm. The dark passenger of complicity is quieted by conversation. But nothing in the external world changes. The manager stays. The coach keeps his position. The neighbor's door still slams at 3 a.m. This would be the start of a deeper problem when we connect it back to the 34 witnesses. In the Genovese case, later interviews revealed residents who heard screams, argued with partners about whether it was a real emergency, or called a friend afterward to process what they thought they had heard. Some talked about it in hallways the next day, or reacted to the newspaper story with shock, trying to reconstruct the night in hindsight. But those conversations arrived after the only moment when action could have saved a life. Gossip creates an illusion of accountability. Everyone knows, so surely someone will do something. That same logic runs through Dexter's world. Detectives trade half-joking theories about his uncanny instincts. Miguel Prado flatters him for understanding killers so well. Deborah senses that the code Harry taught him hides deeper urges. Yet as long as these suspicions remain in side comments and late-night confessions, Dexter's victims stay invisible, and the consequences never land where they belong. The challenge, then, is brutally simple. The next time a conversation ends with everyone knows about someone's behavior, the crucial question is who has actually told a person with the power to intervene. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how that gap between knowing and reporting can be closed by design, and what it would take to build systems where the first whisper is also the first real step toward protection. But even when that first whisper reaches someone with power, another quieter process can still shut everything down. Not through fear, through self-congratulation. This is where moral licensing comes in. Moral licensing is the phenomenon where doing something small and good gives a person unconscious permission to avoid, delay, or even justify less ethical choices later. A single virtuous act becomes an internal credit, a private reassurance that the moral account is paid up, so the harder, riskier action can be postponed without feeling like an outright failure. Let's kick things off with how that might have looked inside Kitty Geneviese's building. Imagine a resident who hears the first scream and walks to the window. They pull the curtain back, see shadows on the street, maybe catch a glimpse of movement, and murmur, "I hope she's okay." Then they step away. In their mind, that moment of checking, that fleeting verbal concern, becomes a kind of proof that they cared. This would be the start of an internal story, where they were not about public assaults, can feel like stepping onto the side of justice. The feed moves, the small action gets logged in memory, and the urgency to confront harassment in a workplace hallway, a subway car, or a friend group quietly drops. The easy, visible act online replaces the uncomfortable confrontation offline. When moral licensing combines with the bystander effect, the result is especially dangerous. Small symbolic acts become substitutes for the demanding interventions that actually change outcomes. A neighbor peeking through the blinds, a coworker sending a vague "Are you okay?" message, a friend making a half-joking comment about someone being creepy around potential victims, all create a sense that something has been done. But the predator, like Dexter moving through Miami or an abuser hiding in plain sight, continues without real resistance. The long-term effects of this pattern are brutal. Victims accumulate, while communities collect comforting anecdotes about how close they came to stepping in. The crucial question becomes, where is symbolic participation being accepted as a stand-in for real-world responsibility? In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how to interrupt that pattern in real time, and what it looks like to turn a fleeting impulse to help into a concrete, accountable act that cannot be quietly rewritten later. Symbolic participation is one thing. The law is another. And here, we run into a brutal twist. In most of the world, failing to act is not a crime. Let's kick things off with a principle that feels almost alien when placed next to Kitty's screams. In most jurisdictions, there is no general legal duty to rescue a stranger. A person can watch an assault from a window, hear an attack through a wall, even see a hit and run unfold in the street, and then simply close the blinds and walk away. As long as that person did not help create the danger and does not have a special role, like parent, doctor, or lifeguard on duty, criminal law usually stays silent. Throughout his life, Dexter relies on that silence. Neighbors hear thuds, coworkers notice bruises on victims' families, detectives sense that something about his calm is off, but the code he lives by is mirrored by the code of the legal system. Unless someone can be tied directly to the kill, suspicion alone is not enough. The law punishes acts. It rarely punishes omissions. There are exceptions that sound promising on paper. Some places have Good Samaritan statutes or duty to report laws that technically require people to call for help if they witness a serious crime or an emergency. Others protect helpers from being sued if a rescue attempt goes wrong. But when we're going to dive deep into how these rules actually operate, a pattern appears. They are narrow, hedged with conditions, and almost never enforced against large, anonymous groups of bystanders. Prosecutors would have to prove who heard what, from where, and at what moment the danger became obvious. In a crowded apartment complex or a busy street, that burden is immense, forms a more realistic way to shift bystander behavior. In the next section, we follow that question into the practical realm, and the answer is going to challenge who we imagine the real witnesses are. So if the law stayed silent in Kitty's hallway and in Dexter's kill rooms, should it start speaking directly to the witnesses? Some legal systems have already answered that with a cautious yes, experimenting with what are often called duty to report or duty to rescue laws. Let's kick things off with what those actually look like. In France, Germany, and several other countries, there are statutes that require anyone who sees a grave danger to another person to provide reasonable assistance, as long as it does not endanger their own life. In parts of the United States, there are narrower versions, mandatory reporting for suspected child abuse, elder abuse, or for certain professionals who discover ongoing violence. These laws rarely demand heroics. They usually demand a phone call. On paper, the benefits seem obvious. A clear duty can create a social baseline, a kind of legal code that says watching harm unfold is not a neutral choice, but a moral and civic failure. Prosecutors also gain a tool for the most shocking cases, where dozens discovered a crime and collectively stayed silent. Even a misdemeanor charge can publicly affirm that the victims were owed more than quiet horror behind closed doors. Throughout his life, Dexter operates in a world where silence is the default, where neighbors hear thuds and see plastic sheeting and decide it is easier not to know. Duty to report laws push against that impulse, telling potential witnesses that looking away has consequences. They try to transform the bystander effect from an unspoken psychological pattern into an addressed social problem. But the long-term effects of turning hesitation into potential liability are complicated. Once failure to report becomes a crime, fear can shift from the emergency itself to the risk of being blamed afterward. People may flood hotlines with panicked, inaccurate reports, not because the truth is clear, but because no one wants to be the one who misjudged the screams. Marginalized communities, already over-policed, may experience these laws as yet another invitation for surveillance into their homes and lives. There is also the reality of traumatized witnesses. Someone who watches a stabbing from a window at 3 a.m. is not a calm observer evaluating legal duties. They are shocked, confused, and often in denial. Criminalizing that frozen moment risks punishing the very psychological mechanisms that the bystander effect research has highlighted for decades. Kitty's building becomes a brutal test case. Imagine a statute that required residents to call authorities if they reasonably believed a violent crime was in progress. Would that have changed the outcome? Some neighbors already did call, in fragmented ways. Others told themselves it was a drunken argument, a domestic dispute, a couple breaking up in the street. A duty to report law does not erase ambiguity. It might simply encourage to neighborhood trainings on responding to public attacks. This would be the start of a cultural shift away from passive witnessing. Instead of telling potential witnesses to simply be aware, these programs hand them a concrete playbook and let them rehearse what stepping in actually looks and feels like. Let's kick things off with the core techniques many of these trainings share, often summarized as the 5 Ds. Direct, distract, delegate, delay, document. Direct intervention might mean calmly telling a harasser to stop, or asking a targeted person, on the spot, whether they want help. Distract shifts the scene without confrontation, by interrupting with a question, spilling a drink, or creating a reason for the victim to move away. Delegate pushes responsibility outward, identifying a bartender, a security guard, a resident assistant, or a supervisor who can intervene with more authority or safety. Delay recognizes that not every moment is safe for action. After an incident, a trained bystander can check in with the victim, offer to walk them somewhere safe, or help them report later. Document, finally, focuses on recording details or video when appropriate, with the understanding that evidence belongs to the victim's needs, not the recorder's curiosity. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on the fact that most witnesses stayed frozen at the edge of scenes, never moving from shock to structured response. These programs, in contrast, treat intervention as a spectrum, not a single dramatic leap into danger. Psychologically, that spectrum matters. Training sessions walk people through the bystander effect, diffusion of responsibility, and pluralistic ignorance, then give them scripted lines to override those reflexes. Phrases like "it may be nothing," "but I'm concerned," or "I'm going to call for help," just in case are practiced out loud, until they feel less like a risky improvisation and more like following a code. Participants are told explicitly that it is acceptable to misread a situation, that a false alarm is morally lighter than silence during real harm. The long-term effects of that reframing can be profound, because it encourages individuals to see themselves as potential helpers rather than passive observers.
Now, bring that back to Kitty's building. Imagine even 3 residents had been through a bystander training that emphasized coordination and assertive communication with authorities. One person could have knocked on a neighbor's door to verify what they heard. Another could have called the police and insisted, repeatedly, that a woman was being attacked, even if details were uncertain. A third could have waited in the lobby to direct officers to the right courtyard, instead of assuming responders would somehow know. The original narrative of 38 silent witnesses was exaggerated, but the gap between what happened and what was possible remains devastating. In the same way that Harry designed a code to channel Dexter's urges, these programs design a social code to channel the first impulses of fear, doubt, and deference. But the killer then moved Kitty toward the darker, recessed spaces behind the building. Sound traveled. Sight did not. Throughout his life, Dexter benefits from similar architecture of concealment, dim corners, abandoned buildings, docks where sound is swallowed by water. Kew Gardens, in a quieter, more ordinary way, offered the same advantage to a predator. Apartments were stacked above the courtyard and the rear lot, so many residents could hear fragments of the assault, yet the angles of the building meant only a few had a clear line of sight. The environment itself made it easy to misread what was happening, or to believe someone closer, someone who could see more, would be the one to act. Environmental designers call this the problem of defensible space. The basic idea is simple. When layouts create clear sight lines, shared common areas, and well-lit paths, residents feel responsible for what happens there and can recognize danger faster. When layouts fracture vision into pockets and blind corners, responsibility diffuses just as quickly as sound does. In a better designed courtyard, the rear stairwell would not have been a hidden tunnel, but an open, visible spine of the building, with lighting that signaled any struggle as an obvious emergency rather than an ambiguous disturbance. This is where modern urban planning becomes a quiet version of Harry's code. Design can either enable the dark passenger in a community those urges to ignore, to withdraw, to let potential victims fend for themselves, or it can channel collective attention toward safety. New developments that repeat Kitty-like blind spots with sealed stairwells, fenced-off parking lots, and private balconies that face away from shared spaces recreate the same conditions that let an attacker move in and out like a ghost. By contrast, safer design treats visibility as a moral tool. Open stairwells that can be seen from multiple apartments, emergency call boxes with bright signage, CCTV cameras that are obvious rather than hidden, and even community bulletin boards in lobbies all send the same message. This is a shared zone, and what happens here is everyone's business. That doesn't guarantee intervention, but it lowers the psychological barrier to noticing, to naming, to stepping in. We cannot redraw every street or rebuild every high-rise, and that limitation matters. But being conscious of environmental factors helps explain why some emergencies snap observers into action, while others dissolve into uncertainty. When the next section turns from bricks and light to policies and social norms, the core question remains the same. Who controls the stage on which danger appears, and who is trained to see it for what it really is? If architecture controls the stage, headlines control the script. The Genovese case did not just unfold in Queens, it unfolded on the front page of the New York Times, with a headline that became an event that changed half a century of psychology. Let's kick things off with that original article in March 1964. Round means less chance anyone will help. Training videos, ethics courses, and even TV dramas echoed this logic. Just like Harry's code gives Dexter a language for his killing urges, the bystander effect gave society a language for collective inaction. But the simplicity came with consequences. Later investigations discovered that the original article was deeply selective. Some neighbors did shout at the attacker. One woman cradled Kitty as she died. At least one call to police was made, though the response was slow and fragmented. By focusing on a clean moral outrage story, Heartless City, Silent Witnesses, the media narrative, obscured systemic failures in emergency response and the messy reality of partial, imperfect efforts to help. Corrections did appear. Nuanced books, follow-up reporting, and interviews with surviving witnesses painted a far more complicated night in Queens. Yet those versions never achieved the same cultural penetration as the myth. The first narrative was too powerful, too teachable, too ready-made for lectures about urban decay and moral decline. Once a headline hardens into cultural memory, later revisions feel like footnotes. So when crime reporting offers a perfect morality tale everyone knew, nobody acted, it is worth asking what complexities are missing. Were there quiet attempts to help that failed? Were institutions underfunded, untrained, or simply uninterested? Throughout his life, Dexter survives because communities prefer simple labels over uncomfortable nuance, and the Genovese story shows how media can train entire societies to see only the cleanest version of guilt. In the next section, the focus shifts from headlines to policies, from one article to the laws and emergency protocols it helped inspire. If a single distorted story can reshape how a culture understands danger, what happens when that story is written directly into the rules that decide who lives and who dies? When the Genovese story hit, it landed like a moral earthquake. 38 witnesses, one woman dying in the dark, and a city that supposedly did nothing. The facts were bent, but the fear it tapped into was brutally real, that modern urban life can turn neighbors into spectators. Let's kick things off with that fear. Throughout his life in a big city, an ordinary resident is surrounded by bodies, noise, and motion. Sirens, arguments on the sidewalk, someone yelling from a window. The background volume is so high that genuine danger can blend into the soundtrack. The Genovese myth crystallized an anxiety that had been building for decades, an event that changed how people imagined apartment walls, not as protection, but as barriers between isolated lives. Many readers quietly recognized themselves in those supposed witnesses, not as cold villains who wanted someone to die, but as overwhelmed observers, unsure which cries are life or death, and which are just another late-night argument. This is where the psychology comes in. Social psychologists later discovered the bystander effect, showing that when multiple people shared hesitation. Ironically, that flawed story helped trigger reforms that saved lives. Public outrage helped push the creation of the 911 system, so calling for help became a clear, standardized action instead of a confusing choice among local numbers. Police departments and city governments started paying more attention to response times, dispatcher training, and how ordinary residents understood their role in an emergency. Public campaigns urged witnesses to call, to intervene safely, to treat screams and crashes as potential crises rather than background noise. So the myth did damage, but it also did work. It exaggerated the failures of one night to illuminate failures that were happening everywhere. The long-term effects of that tension are still with us. A flawed story can catalyze important change, but once new evidence emerges, there is a responsibility to refine the narrative. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into what happens when those refined facts finally challenge the legend that built an entire era of urban fear. When the legend of Kitty Genovese met the reality of later investigations, it exposed a harder question than who got the facts wrong. It forced a look at whether a culture of watching in silence has actually changed since 1964, or whether the stage just got bigger and brighter. Let's kick things off with what has clearly improved. In Kitty's era, there was no shared language for what Layton and Darley would later call the bystander effect. Now, social psychology is mainstream. High school classes, workplace trainings, and public campaigns routinely explain diffusion of responsibility, social proof, and pluralistic ignorance. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on those same dynamics, trusting that neighbors, coworkers, and even fellow detectives would misread danger as normal because everyone else stayed calm. On a practical level, the infrastructure is radically different. In 1964, calling for help meant finding a landline, deciding which operator to reach, and hoping the call was taken seriously. Today, emergency numbers are standardized, smartphones are nearly universal, and a single tap can connect to 911 from the sidewalk, a subway car, or a locked bedroom. That alone has saved countless victims whose only ally was someone willing to make a call. There is also a wider public conversation about harassment and abuse. From workplace reporting systems to social movements exposing serial predators, silence is no longer the unquestioned default. Predators who once hid behind charming personas, much like Dexter using his job and social role as cover, now face at least the possibility that a witness will record, post, or report. But the same tools that empower can also erode urgency. The constant feed of violent clips, breaking news, and true crime has created a low-level desensitization. When every scroll contains an assault, a disaster, or a confession, an event that changed one person's entire life can register as just another video. Silence is the expected behavior. This would be the start of a different kind of narrative, where the presence of a crowd increases the chance that someone acts. So are we moving toward more intervention or more spectatorship? The answer is still unsettled, balanced between technology that lowers the barrier to help and platforms that turn suffering into content. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into what it actually takes for a single witness to break from the crowd, challenge the code of silence, and accept the consequences of being the one who refuses to look away. That break from the crowd almost never starts clean. It usually begins with a knot in the stomach that refuses to go away. When we're going to dive deep into the long-term effects of inaction, the story stops being about the victim for a moment and becomes about the witnesses who have to live with the echo of what they did or failed to do. In the Genovese case, later interviews with neighbors revealed a pattern that feels painfully familiar. Some residents admitted hearing a woman scream, but convinced themselves it was a drunken argument, a lover's fight, a domestic dispute that did not require intervention. Others remembered going to the window, watching for a moment, then pulling the curtain shut and telling themselves that someone else had already called. Years later, those same people described guilt that clung to them like a second skin, an event that changed how they saw every siren in the distance. Over time, many tried to rewrite the night. A witness might emphasize that a light was turned on, that a window was opened, that a half-formed plan to call the police was considered. A small gesture becomes, in memory, evidence that they tried. This is not unique to one New York courtyard. In workplace abuse scandals, in small towns with a creepy uncle, in schools where a coach is finally exposed, bystanders often insist they never really knew, or that they once pulled someone aside, as if that fragment can balance the scale. Psychologists call this self-protective editing. The mind blurs clear screams into maybe it wasn't that serious. It downgrades certainty into confusion. It upgrades hesitation into action. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on this exact mechanism, moving through colleagues and neighbors who sensed that something was off, but later told themselves they had only seen a stressed forensic analyst, not a man with a dark passenger. The truth was more uncomfortable, so memory bent away from it. Yet regret is not only corrosive, it can be catalytic. Some Genovese neighbors later became outspoken advocates for dialing the police at the faintest sign of danger. Survivors of bystander inaction in workplaces pushed for reporting policies, determined that no one else freeze the way they once did. The crucial difference is whether regret is acknowledged as a clear moral failure or buried under layers of defensiveness, legalistic excuses, and "it wasn't my responsibility." This is where the mirror turns toward the audience. Most people have walked past someone the aisle. No one wants to escalate. A micro-intervention is not a dramatic confrontation. It is a simple move across the aisle, making eye contact with a potential victim and asking, "Hey, do you want to switch seats?" The predator hears it. The rest of the bus hears it. A new frame is created. Someone has discovered that this interaction is not invisible. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on the opposite dynamic. Silence, a room full of detectives, all seeing small anomalies, but no one willing to break the spell with a direct question. Micro-interventions work because they send a social signal that the situation is being taken seriously. In social psychology, this cuts directly against pluralistic ignorance, where each witness scans the group, sees calm faces, and assumes there is no real emergency. Those tiny actions become social cues. A hand placed lightly on a bar, and a steady, "Are you okay here?" A person standing up on a train and moving physically closer when a conversation turns tense. Even a neutral interruption in an office, stepping into a closed-door argument with, "Hey, quick question about that report," can give a target a face-saving exit and tells everyone present that the dynamic is being observed. Pattern interrupt. The goal is not to be right. The goal is to be reversible. A micro-intervention accepts uncertainty. It does not require absolute proof that someone is about to kill, assault, or abuse. It only requires accepting that a few seconds of mild awkwardness is a far smaller cost than the long-term effects of doing nothing while a dark passenger operates unchecked. On a crowded sidewalk, that might mean pausing and turning fully toward an argument so it is clear that at least one witness is now focused. In a workplace, it might mean sitting down near a tense one-on-one or following up later with, "If anything in that meeting felt off, there is support." These are not grand reveals of the truth. They are pressure on the invisible shield that offenders depend on. To make any of this usable under stress, the brain needs scripts. Before the crisis, it helps to mentally rehearse 2 or 3 go-to phrases and moves. Do you need help? Do you want to come over here? Should we get someone else involved? When those lines are preloaded, the choice in the moment is not between silence and the perfect response. It is between silence and a practiced, simple intervention. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how one of these small, prepared actions can escalate into formal reports, real consequences, and finally force a dangerous person into the open, even when an entire community has been trained to look away. So far, we've focused on what one person can do in a moment when everything feels frozen. But the real power shift happens when a silent crowd turns into a coordinated team. The bystander effect thrives on isolation. The antidote is connection, created deliberately in seconds. Let's kick things off with a simple, counterintuitive move: assign responsibility. When everyone hears picture a crowded bar. Music loud, conversations overlapping, a woman in the corner shrinking away from a man who will not let her leave. Most patrons clock it, then mentally file it as not my business. A quiet intervener does not need a badge. They need a plan. Make eye contact with the bartender. Can you check on her? She doesn't look safe. Now the bartender has both permission and a mandate, and the social proof of being asked in front of others. On a street, the same principle applies. A person is on the sidewalk, crying, barely coherent. Instead of approaching alone or walking past, a quick scan of the crowd can recruit an ally. Can you stand here with me while I talk to them? Suddenly, the dynamic is no longer stranger versus stranger. It is a small team, visibly engaged, which also deters potential predators who, like Dexter, prefer isolated victims. This is leadership without title. It is the opposite of Harry teaching Dexter to hide his urges and kill in secret. Here, the leadership move is to name the problem out loud and propose a simple next step. The long-term effects of this habit are profound. In workplaces, on campuses, in neighborhoods, one brave sentence can normalize speaking up. Now imagine Kitty's building as a counterfactual. One resident hears the screams, feels the same fear, the same uncertainty, but instead of freezing, walks down the hall and knocks. I think someone's being attacked. Can we check together? That second person changes everything. 2 residents at the window. 2 voices calling the police. 2 witnesses who can no longer pretend they misunderstood. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how this kind of shared action doesn't have to stop at the hallway or the sidewalk, but can evolve into formal reports, paper trails, and consequences that finally corner a predator who has spent an entire life hiding in plain sight. Shared action in the hallway is powerful, but there is always a second question hiding underneath the courage. What happens if stepping in turns the next headline into another victim, not another witness who finally acted? Throughout his life, Dexter weaponizes that fear. His entire life as a careful killer depends on neighbors, coworkers, and even trained officers calculating risk and deciding to stay back. In real cases like the murder of Kitty Genovese, early reports painted a brutal picture of 30-plus residents watching and doing nothing. Later investigations discovered a more complicated truth. Some called, some shouted, some misread the screams as a domestic argument. The point is not that everyone was evil. The point is that danger scrambles judgment, and courage without a plan can get people killed. So safety has to come first. Courage does not require rushing directly toward a knife, a gun, or an unpredictable aggressor. In Dexter's world, Harry's code is built on this calculation. Harry teaches Dex a way when a door closes, when a crowd gathers, can turn an impossible rescue into a realistic chance to reach the victim, offer cover, or guide them to safety once the immediate threat passes. And in a world full of cameras, documenting can be part of intervention, not a replacement for it. Filming, while another person calls emergency services, capturing license plates, faces, and exact timing creates a record that can later pin down the truth in a way memory alone cannot. Dexter survives for years because his kills leave almost nothing behind. Real predators depend on the same gap. Footage paired with formal reports becomes an event that changed what authorities can prove. The goal here is not to turn viewers into vigilantes hunting their own Bay Harbor butcher. Harry's choice to channel rather than cure Dexter's killing urges was a catastrophic overreach, with long-term effects that destroyed almost everyone close to him. The aim is different, thoughtful, prepared responders who weigh risk without defaulting to comfortable inaction. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how those calls, reports, and recordings move from isolated acts of bravery to a paper trail that finally corners predators who have been hiding in plain sight for years. If paper trails and reports are the system's memory, then kids are where the culture itself gets rewritten. The long-term effects of bystander silence only really change when the next generation grows up, assuming that stepping in is normal, not heroic. Let's kick things off with modeling, because children watch everything. On a playground, when a stronger kid shoves a smaller one, the real lesson is not in the school's anti-bullying poster. It is in whether adults walk over, separate them, and calmly name what happened, or glance up, hesitate, and then go back to their phones. Throughout his life, a child is building an internal code about conflict. Is intervention expected, or is minding our own business the safest move? In public, the same pattern repeats. A parent notices a stranger yelling at a partner in a parking lot. Do they slow down, make eye contact, ask if help is needed, or at least call for security? Or do they rush the family into the car and explain later that it was none of our concern? That single moment becomes an event that changed how a child understands risk, responsibility, and the invisible line between victim and witness. Stories like Kitty Genovese's can be part of this education, but they have to be handled with care. With younger kids, the focus is not on gore or the exact way she was killed. The focus is on the idea that many people saw or heard that something was wrong and did not help enough, fast enough. The lesson is that confusion, fear, and waiting for someone else to act are common, but they are not excuses. As kids grow older, we're going to dive deep into more nuance. Some neighbors tried. Some misread the danger. Some assumed the police had already been a project. Each cohort can move the norm a little closer to, of course, we step in, and farther from we stay out of it, the same way each person who discovered Dexter's truth had a choice to either confront or look away. The question is how those early lessons, those practice lines, and those school corridors full of silent witnesses eventually collide with real predators who count on everyone staying quiet. In the next section, we follow that collision into the institutions that claim to protect victims and what happens when the calls finally cannot be ignored. Those calls that finally cannot be ignored usually sound loudest in institutions, but sometimes the call is much quieter. No headlines, no crowd, no security camera, just one person, one moment, and a decision that will not be shared across 34 windows. Psychologists tell us the classic bystander effect is strongest in groups. The more people who can act, the easier it becomes to assume someone else will. Responsibility diffuses, urgency blurs, and silence starts to feel rational. When there is only a single witness, that diffusion disappears, but the fear and uncertainty remain. The danger does not shrink just because the audience does. Let's kick things off with the most stripped-down scenario. Walking down a quiet street late at night, there is a shape on the sidewalk. Unconscious? Drunk? Asleep? There is no crowd to scan for cues, no neighbors peeking out, no chorus of other reactions to copy. In that vacuum, the mind runs through consequences. Is this really an emergency? Could approaching be dangerous? What if the call is a false alarm? The bystander effect has not vanished. It has just changed form, from social pressure to internal doubt. A different version plays out over weeks instead of minutes. A friend's relationship slowly shifts. Jokes that sting, bruises explained away, messages that must be answered immediately. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on people ignoring subtle patterns like this, trusting the public image more than the private signals. In real communities, those early warning signs are often discovered by, say, a single person first. The dilemma becomes whether to name what is being seen as abuse or to convince oneself it is an overreaction. Then there is the paper-thin wall, raised voices, a thud, crying that stops too fast. Being the only one who hears it can feel like an event that changed the entire building, even if no one else ever knows. There is no way to hide behind social proof, but there is also no one to validate that it was real, that it was serious, that intervention was justified. Being the lone witness is both clarifying and terrifying. Clarifying, because there is no one to defer to, no illusion that someone else will step in. Terrifying, because there is no shared burden, no instant confirmation, no built-in support system. If action is taken, the consequences, good or bad, participation. Let's kick things off with the most uncomfortable version of that idea, the moment when everyone knows, and life just keeps going. In small towns, offices, and families, there is always a version of the running joke. The coworkers who laugh about the manager, who can't be alone in a room with interns, yet still cover his calendar, still smooth over complaints, still invite him to after-work drinks. The relatives who whisper warnings about Uncle Mark at holiday dinners, tell children not to be alone with him, but keep putting his name on the guest list anyway. On paper, no one has killed anyone. In practice, the pattern of protection is doing a lot of work. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on that same pattern. Harry's code did not exist in a vacuum. It depended on a ring of people who sensed that something was off, but chose not to confront the truth they had discovered. Neighbors who noticed Dexter always arrived after the blood, coworkers who saw the way he lit up around crime scene photos, loved ones who registered the dark passenger in his eyes and filed it under quirky. Each individual silence looked small. Collectively, it created cover. Philosophically, this is the line between omission and commission. Most legal systems draw a hard distinction between killing someone and failing to save them. Morally, the gap is not always that clean. When a danger is known, named, and repeated, failing to report can, in some cases, function like enabling. The coworker who walks a new hire away from the predator's office but never goes to HR is not swinging the knife, but is helping maintain the environment where victims keep appearing. At the same time, the gray areas are real. Fear, dependency, and culture all press down on the impulse to act. An employee who needs the job. A spouse financially tied to the abuser. A community trained to believe that reporting is betrayal. These pressures do not erase the harm, but they explain why silence can feel like the only viable choice in the moment. In Dexter's world, the code itself becomes that pressure. Harry's choice to manage rather than expose creates a rule that anyone who loves Dexter must protect the secret, even as the body count rises. So the ethical question is not just, why didn't they speak up? It is, how many times can someone watch harm unfold, adjust around it, and still claim to be only a witness? This would be the start of a different kind of accountability, one that asks every character and everyone watching to audit their own circles. Is there a person whose behavior has been normalized through quiet workarounds and private warnings? What would it take to move from managing the danger to actually naming it? In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how institutions answer that question for people, and how codes, legal, professional, and personal, can either break the silence or harden it into policy. Institutions can write codes, but in the moment, someone still has to move. And that brings the focus back to the person at the window. See it as a lookout post. The identity shift is subtle, but profound, from isolated observer to part of a social safety net. In this frame, noticing and responding to potential harm is not nosiness. It is a normal civic duty. Just as Harry created a code to channel Dexter's urges, communities can create informal codes that channel attention into protection. If a scream is heard, at least look. If a fight spills into the hallway, at least call. If a pattern of danger is discovered, at least name it. That begins with personal rules. Think of being the kind of person who checks, the kind of neighbor who steps into the hallway, the kind of coworker who quietly documents a pattern, the kind of bystander who dials emergency services first and worries about awkwardness later. These micro-commitments counter the bystander effect by pre-deciding the choice, so the moment is not a debate, but a follow-through. There are countless small interventions that never make headlines. A resident who knocked on a door during a loud argument and years later learned that the interruption ended a beating. A passerby who filmed an aggressive arrest and later discovered the footage became the only protection for the victim in court. In each case, the person at the window did not know the long-term effects of that decision, but the consequences rippled far beyond the moment. To make that shift real, it helps to articulate a private code, a sentence, even unspoken, that says, when standing at the window, the goal is not to be right, but to be responsive. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how formal codes either support or sabotage that personal promise, and how the gap between written policy and lived action can become an event that changed everything for the next potential victim. So let's kick things off with a rewind. The same courtyard, the same 34 windows, but this time we pause at every decision point and ask not why didn't they act, but what could have realistically happened instead. This is where we're going to dive deep into the difference between a frozen witness and a responsive neighbor. The first scream cuts through the night. In the real case, many residents later said it sounded like a lover's quarrel, not an attempted kill. Pluralistic ignorance kicked in. Everyone glanced at the other windows, saw no one panicking, and downgraded the danger. In an alternative version, just one resident treats that ambiguity as a trigger, not a sedative. They call the police and say, clearly and concretely, that a woman is screaming, that it sounds like she is being attacked, and that the location is the front of the building. No need to be a hero, just a precise reporter of what has been discovered. Then comes the famous shout from a neighbor's window. In reality, it scattered the attacker briefly, but did not end the threat. Imagine if that shout had been step one, not the full response. The same neighbor, after yelling, could have immediately knocked on the closest doors, waking 2 precious minutes. Throughout his life, Dexter survives because bystanders, coworkers, even loved ones hesitate at these exact junctions. Harry's code exploits that hesitation. The lesson here is not that every neighbor should have rushed into the dark. It is that a handful of decisive, coordinated actions from a few people can alter the consequences for everyone else, even if the majority remain passive and afraid. Recognizing fear, confusion, and social pressure does not absolve a community. It clarifies the battlefield. In the next section, we turn that reconstructed what-if toward modern hallways, offices, and online spaces, asking where the quiet intervals are now, and who will write a better response before the next event that changed someone's life forever. What if the real horror in this story is not the man with the knife, but the quiet chorus of windows that never fully opened. 34 sets of eyes and ears scattered across a courtyard, turning a live emergency into background noise. Let's kick things off with that contrast. Winston Moseley represents a singular, concentrated evil. One predator, one set of deliberate choices, one person who walked into the night already prepared to kill. Throughout his life, Moseley had crossed internal lines long before he crossed Kitty's path. He hunted, he returned, he escalated. The violence was not an accident, it was a goal. In narrative terms, he is the obvious villain, the dark passenger made flesh. But the neighbors create a different kind of danger, one that is distributed, deniable, and disturbingly familiar. No single resident decided, in clear language, to let Kitty die. Instead, many residents made smaller choices, assuming someone else had called, misreading screams as a domestic dispute, turning down the volume on a terrifying reality, just enough to sleep. The result was the same. A predator operated in an environment that, functionally, let him work. This is where we're going to dive deep into responsibility. A community cannot control whether a Winston Moseley exists. There will always be individuals whose urges fall so far outside a moral code that they become predators. What a community can shape is the terrain those predators move through. Is it a landscape where a scream automatically triggers lights, 911 calls, and doors opening? Or is it a landscape where that same scream is treated as an unfortunate soundtrack to someone else's problem? Stories like Kitty's keep repeating in different costumes. In workplaces where everyone knows a manager harasses subordinates, but the complaints never make it past nervous whispers. In online spaces where a target is dogpiled, doxxed, and threatened, while thousands watch, scroll, and rationalize that someone with more influence will intervene. Each scenario exposes the same fragile safety net. When everyone assumes someone else is the net, there is, in practice, no net at all. Psychology gives this pattern a name: the bystander. The long-term effects of that night are not only about one killer and one victim, but about how ordinary lives drift through danger, hearing echoes of harm and filing them away as background noise. So, let's kick things off with something very practical. Throughout his life, Dexter mapped every environment he entered: lighting, exits, cameras, how long it would take police to respond. That same analytical lens can be turned toward everyday spaces. Commutes, workplaces, apartment buildings, online communities, each has its own likely emergencies. A cramped subway car at midnight suggests harassment or assault. An office with a volatile manager suggests bullying or abuse. A group chat where insults escalate suggests targeted harassment. When those patterns are discovered in advance, hesitation later has fewer excuses. From there, we're going to dive deep into preparation. Social psychologists like Layton and Darley showed that in a crisis, the brain searches for a script. If no script exists, paralysis is common. A personal bystander plan is essentially a pre-written script that can mean deciding ahead of time who to call first in each environment, what exact sentence to use to break the silence, and how to recruit others nearby. Can someone call 911? That person needs help, spoken loudly and directed at a specific face, cuts through the diffusion of responsibility that protected Dexter and so many real predators. Micro-interventions matter. Not everyone can physically confront danger, and not every scenario demands it. But almost everyone can take one small action: hitting the emergency button on a train, filming at a safe distance, moving next to a victim, and asking, "Are you okay?" Or quietly walking a coworker to HR after a threatening encounter. This would be the start of a personal code that channels the urge to help into concrete, realistic behaviors rather than vague, good intentions. Accountability also changes outcomes. In the same way, Harry's code gained power because it was spoken aloud and repeated, bystander plans become real when shared. Telling a friend or family member, if something feels wrong on the train, we agree to say something, creates a mutual pact. Each person becomes the other's reminder that freezing has consequences, that silence is itself a choice with victims on the other end. Incremental change is crucial. No one has to transform overnight into a fearless rescuer. Committing to just one or two specific behaviors in one familiar setting already shifts the odds. The next section will push this further, inviting public reflection in comments and conversations about moments of intervention and silence, turning private codes into shared culture. But that raises a harder question. What happens when systems, not just individuals, reward the bystander and punish the one who speaks? When systems reward silence, a whole building can become a kind of dark, yet the basic pattern held: dozens of potential witnesses, partial interventions, delayed calls, and no one taking clear ownership of the emergency in real time. Psychologically, that night became the prototype for diffusion of responsibility. The more eyes on the courtyard, the easier it became for each person to assume someone else would call, someone else would intervene, someone else would pay the social and personal cost of being wrong. Pluralistic ignorance layered on top of that. Residents looked to each other's calm faces, closed curtains, and lights switching off as proof that this was not life or death, even as Kitty's actual body told a different truth. Fear and self-preservation ran underneath everything. People worried the attacker might turn on them, or that getting involved would pull them into court, retaliation, or public exposure. Moral licensing played a quieter role: a shouted warning, a light turned on, a half-dialed number felt like enough to say, later, that they had tried. Throughout his life, Dexter depends on similar half-measures in others, trusting that once someone has done the bare minimum, they will stop short of exposing his code or confronting his kills. The consequences were enormous. Bibb Latan and John Darley read those early reports and built a whole research program on the bystander effect, showing in controlled experiments how help rates plummet when observers believe others are also watching. City officials, facing public outrage, pushed for centralized emergency response. This would be the start of the 911 system, replacing a maze of local numbers with one clear call to action. Over time, intervention training, workplace reporting channels, and awareness campaigns all grew out of that same question. How do we make it easy to act and harder to look away? The Genevieve story endures not because every detail was accurate, but because it gives a lens for examining our own potential for inaction, whether that is a hallway hearing domestic violence, a group chat watching harassment, or a small town that always knew about a predator. So the real question is no longer how could they, but how can we make sure we don't? In the next section, we're going to dive deep into that shift, moving from case study to practical design, how laws, workplaces, and communities can rewrite the code so that the default is not passive witnessing, but active, shared responsibility. So the real question is no longer how could they, but how can we make sure we don't? That shift only matters if it turns into action, and that action has to start long before sirens, headlines, or a body count. Throughout his life, Dexter survived because silence was the norm. Neighbors, coworkers, even people who felt something off around him rarely compared notes. In real communities, the same pattern plays out with predators, abusers, and public assaults. To break that code of quiet, this section is going to be about active engagement, not passive viewing. First, there is the collective record. In the comments, ordinary witnesses can write rules for when they will not stay silent. A sentence on a phone lock screen, a sticky note on a laptop, a line on a fridge, I will always call when I hear repeated screams, or I will check in when someone goes suddenly quiet after a cruel joke. This would be the start of a different kind of discipline, one that makes intervention a default reflex instead of a heroic exception. Awareness alone is only the prologue. The long-term effects of this kind of reflection are measured the next time a hallway falls silent, a chat explodes with harassment, or a neighbor hears a thud through the wall and feels that familiar hesitation. That is the moment when all the analysis in the world either collapses or converts into a small, concrete move, a call, a knock, a message, a report. At the beginning of this story, there were 34 windows and 0 arrests, an image of a city lit up and paralyzed. The future this series has been pointing toward is different. Fewer dark panes, more lights switching on, more doors opening into the same corridor as people step out together. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how institutions can support that shift, designing laws, workplaces, and platforms so that when those lights turn on, the system actually backs the people who chose to act. Designing better systems matters, but even the best policy does nothing if the people inside it hesitate, freeze, or quietly step back from the window. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on that gap between what people believed they would do and what they actually did when the dark passenger walked into the room. In the middle of a documentary, it feels easy to make a private promise. Of course the phone would be dialed. Of course a scream would not be ignored. The hard part comes 3 months from now, on a work night, with tired eyes, thin walls, and a half-heard argument that might be serious or might just be another fight. The long-term effects of this kind of content are not decided while the credits roll. They are decided in those blurry, ambiguous moments when no camera is running and no narration is guiding the frame. That is why this resolve cannot stay frozen as a single emotional spike. It has to be treated like Harry's code, revisited, tested, updated as circumstances change. New jobs, new cities, new online spaces bring different corridors and different doors. Commitments made today will need translation later, which is why regular check-ins matter. Talking about these ideas with new people, comparing personal bystander plans, and asking how others would handle the same scene keeps the promise from fading into background noise. Simple, repeated practice is what turns intention into reflex. That can mean noticing low-stakes chances to help, staying with a confused stranger until the right platform is found, walking a friend to a car after a party, stepping between a cruel comment and its target at work. It can mean praising